I want to thank all the same people Mark thanked, especially the Sloan Foundation, for having the vision to support this series. Thanks for coming out tonight. It's amazing how many of you raised your hand to say you had never seen this movie. And I want to extend a heartfelt apology because this talk is full of spoilers. Because I kind of just assumed all of you would have seen it already. So I'm sorry. Okay, it's fun to be here. What we're here for tonight, obviously, is to see Blade Runner, the 1982 movie directed by Ridley Scott, based on a 1968 novel by Philip K. Dick called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Okay, as Mark said, I think my qualifications or my excuse for being here are that I host and produce a podcast about technology and the future called Soonish. The motto of the show is, the future is shaped by technology, but technology is shaped by us. And we're part of the Hub and Spoke Audio Collective, which is a Boston-based collective of nonfiction, story-driven, smart, semi-educational podcasts. If you learn something, it's sort of intentional and sort of accidental. I'm also a lifelong technology journalist. I'm currently writing a monthly column at Scientific American called Ventures. And kind of most relevant, last year I edited a book of science fiction stories for the MIT Press and MIT Technology Review called 12 Tomorrows. And I think it's probably available across the street at Brookline Booksmith, and I have a copy with me right here in case you're interested. So I definitely recommend checking that out. And I'm going to talk in a minute about how this book's a little bit different from the movie, but I'll get to that. I'm not sure any of that makes me a good film critic, but I did want to share two big ideas about why Blade Runner is such a remarkable film. It's surely on the top 10 list of the most important and memorable science fiction movies ever made. Now, idea one is pretty obvious. It's about the style and the texture of the world that we see on screen. Now, there's a term of art in science fiction and fantasy writing that I'm sure some of you know. It's called world building. It's all the effort that a writer or a director puts into creating a believable backdrop for the action. Not just a visual backdrop, but almost a whole culture around the story. The world building in Blade Runner reached a new level for Hollywood, and it set a standard for every science fiction movie that came after. The world of Blade Runner is very much a dystopia. Specifically, it's set in a nightmarish version of Los Angeles in the year 2019. Which is why we're here tonight, because we finally arrived in that ominous year. Now, the 2019 in the movie is pretty depressing, just like all noir cyberpunk fiction. But the thing is, it's also kind of alluring. Now, you may not want to move to that grimy, dark 2019 Los Angeles, but when you finish seeing this movie, you will want to kind of visit, I think. You'll want to be able to fly above the city in one of those hover cars. You'll want to be able to watch the fire-belching smokestacks and maybe set your hover car down on a rooftop so you can feel the cold rain on your face. Now, in the movie, the exact nature of the decline or the disaster that led to this dystopia is never really spelled out. It could have been a war, it could have been pollution, or it could just be technology run rampant. In any case, in this future, everyone who has enough money has fled the Earth for an easier life in colonies elsewhere in the solar system, where they're served by armies of replicant laborers, androids. Now, pretty much everyone who's left on Earth is poor or depressed or defective, although there does still seem to be an active police force, and Earth is still the headquarters for giant companies like the Tyrell Corporation. I saw this movie in its first theatrical release in 1982, when I was 15 years old, and I remember being simultaneously enthralled and appalled by the world of the movie. Now, Blade Runner was not the first science fiction dystopia, by any means, to hit the big screen. We'd already seen plenty of bleak futures in movies like Planet of the Apes, Mad Max, and Escape from New York. But this was the first big Hollywood film to give real texture and plausibility to a dystopia. It worked because it was so detailed on both the macro and the micro levels. I think of the strangely gorgeous wide shots of Los Angeles, accomplished with the help of special effects supervisor Douglas Trumbull, who is a Massachusetts native, who has spoken here at this theater and who was famously involved in 2001: A Space Odyssey, creating the special effects for that movie. And I also think of the more human scale sets, like the dusty, cluttered interiors of the old rotting buildings where the fugitive replicants take shelter. The world of Blade Runner looked lived in and run down and partially abandoned. It looked like our worst visions of urban decay or of the Rust Belt writ large. And it was all the more believable because it didn't try to look shiny and futuristic in a kind of Walt Disney Tomorrowland way. Another part of the texture, I think, came from the idea that the world culture of the future would be thoroughly intermixed, and that the streets of Los Angeles in 2019 would be full of people speaking a variety of Asian languages, North American languages, European languages, eating from street-side sushi bars while giant billboards floated overhead on dirigibles. And all of that felt pretty alien in 1982, but it kind of feels natural today because our reality is far more multicultural. So I think the movie got that right. And there's one more premise in the movie that has only grown more believable with the passage of time. It's the idea that the human world could end up being dominated by giant, impersonal technology companies or industrial organizations. Now again, that idea isn't new. You can see that going back as far as the 1920s in movies like Fritz Lang's Metropolis, or in the 1970s in movies like Soylent Green or Westworld. But back when those films came out, portrayals of corporatization felt like a warning. Today, they feel more like a statement of fact. Our world is, to an increasing degree, shaped by the needs and ambitions of technology magnates and the companies they've built. Eldon Tyrell would fit in just fine on the stage at Davos. And finally, we're a lot more intimate today with the possibility that human activity could completely transform the surface of the planet into a bleak, urbanized wasteland. In the early 80s, you could begin to see how industrialization and environmental decay and nuclear proliferation might destroy the natural world. But still, in 1982, carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere were at only 340 parts per million. Today, they're around 410 parts per million. That's higher than they've been at any time in the last 3 million years. I don't think those belching smokestacks that you see in the movie were necessarily intended as symbols of climate change, because the warming caused by greenhouse gases wasn't part of public awareness at that time. If anything, at that time we were more worried about the opposite, which was the prospect of nuclear winter. But the smokestacks were a symbol of heedless industrialization. And after spending 4 more decades pouring as much carbon and methane into the atmosphere as we possibly can, it is much easier to imagine a world like Blade Runner's, where storm clouds have permanently blotted out the sun. So, Blade Runner tapped into a lot of trends that were in their early stages in 1982 and have only advanced since then, which makes the movie look prescient in a lot of ways. In other ways, though, not so much. I mean, it doesn't really rain all the time yet. We've still got time to invent technologies that could reduce emissions and take carbon out of the atmosphere. And while dystopias are useful sometimes as warnings, because somebody's got to play the part of Cassandra, and it might as well be novelists and filmmakers as amazing as Philip K. Dick and Ridley Scott, I think for our survival, we've got to focus on the positive possibilities and not dwell too long in the dystopias. I have a favorite quote from Oxford physicist David Deutsch. He says, "Almost no one is creative in fields in which they are pessimistic." If you believe the future will be this bleak, you're not going to work very hard to prevent it. And that can turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think science fiction dystopias have, in a way, reached their saturation point, which is why I banned them when I was asked to recruit writers to contribute to this anthology, 12 Tomorrows. It's a very optimistic kind of science fiction book, and I wanted to use my one shot at being a science fiction editor to make that point. Okay, all that said, Blade Runner stands out as an extremely compelling dystopia. It's a useful dystopia, you might say, and in some ways a more accurate dystopia than anyone would have liked. But beyond all that style and texture, there is one other idea, my second big idea, that makes Blade Runner so important. I'm talking about the central philosophical question in the story, which was, of course, put most succinctly by Philip K. Dick, do androids dream of electric sheep? Now, Ridley Scott made some gigantic changes to Dick's story along the way, but the novel's main argument does survive in the movie. And one way to put that argument is that as technology advances, there's less and less difference between us and our machines. This is science fiction, and every good science fiction story boils down to a big thought experiment. So Dick and Scott have permission to stretch reality. And the movie and the book show a world where artificial intelligence and robotics have advanced to the point where the androids, or replicants, as they're called in the movie, are as human as the actual humans. Perhaps more so, in fact. They're portrayed as fully conscious, sentient beings who just happen to have artificial bodies and artificial memories. As a practical forecast of actual progress in AI, that's where the book and the movie get a failing grade. The truth is, we're no closer to creating machine consciousness in 2019 than we were in 1982. We don't even understand what makes humans conscious. So how could we possibly hope to engender consciousness in a machine? The only caveat to that is that thanks to an emerging field of AI research called machine learning, and thanks to techniques that use artificial neural networks to do deep learning and related things, we do have software that can mimic intelligence. By churning through huge amounts of data, most of it drawn directly from the internet, the software can detect patterns and generate plausible new ones. In that way, it can come up with images and music and writing and speech that, at least at a superficial level, looks and sounds like the product of consciousness. And the technology is always getting better, slowly, thanks to improvements in processing speed and storage, and above all, just the massive proliferation of the amount of data that these programs can act on and learn from. So right now, you can't really carry on an extended conversation with Alexa or Siri, but just wait a couple of years, you actually will be able to do that. Still, these systems are about as conscious as a lump of coal. It's all smoke and mirrors and lots of data. There is no there. So why is the question about the status of replicants still compelling in Blade Runner, even though it's so far-fetched? I would say it's because there's an overt question at the heart of the movie, and then there's a covert question. The overt question is the same as the one asked by countless other science fiction stories and movies and books, from 2001: A Space Odyssey all the way to HBO's version of Westworld. That question is whether conscious machines should have the same rights as humans. Blade Runner asks that question by making its protagonist, Rick Deckard, a bounty hunter whose main expertise is identifying and hunting down renegade replicants. Now, it won't be a spoiler, I hope, for anyone at this point, that as the story progresses, Deckard starts to question his own beliefs about the rights of the machines he's hunting. He starts out as a tool of the corporate and law enforcement bureaucracy, mercilessly enforcing a rule that says replicants must be deactivated or retired after just 4 years, lest they become too empathic and too human. But by the end, he's in open rebellion against that rule. He has fallen in love with a replicant, Rachel, and with the help of a sympathetic colleague named Gaff, played marvelously by Edward James Olmos, Deckard decides to escape with her into the wilderness. Now, as I said, artificial consciousness wasn't even remotely achievable in 1968 when Philip K. Dick wrote his novel. It wasn't achievable in 1982 when Ridley Scott made this movie, and it still isn't achievable today. And my own view is that there really is no point in the foreseeable future when we'll be forced to grapple with the overt question of machine rights. So what is the movie really about? I think there's also the covert question. I think that whenever we talk about AI and conscious machines in science fiction, it's almost always a way to think about consciousness in general. How do we know that we're conscious? How do we know that other beings are conscious? If other beings are conscious, then what do we owe to them? What makes consciousness so precious? Those questions preoccupied Descartes in the 18th century, and they still preoccupy philosophers and neuroscientists and cognitive scientists today. and they are live, present, operational questions. We are surrounded by other conscious beings whom we use and abuse in a multitude of ways, namely other animals. We're still deciding what we really think about how other beings with consciousness should be treated. And somehow, it's harder to get serious about that question when we're applying it to dolphins or cows or dogs. It becomes more poignant and immediate when we apply it to machines that look like humans. That's what the movie is doing. And if that's what it takes to get us thinking harder about consciousness and the rights of sentient beings, then I am all in. Okay, one more thing along these lines. There is a huge, perpetual, unresolved meta question about Blade Runner. That's the question of whether Deckard himself is a replicant. Now, I'm going to say I'm agnostic about this. I think the answer that you're driven to depends on which version of the movie you're watching. And some of you may know that Blade Runner has gone through 7 versions, with increasing levels of hands-on tinkering from the director, Ridley Scott. We are seeing the last version tonight. It's called The Final Cut, and it was first released in 2007. Now, in the novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?, Deckard and the androids are presented as morally interchangeable, but it's a metaphorical equivalence, not a literal one. Dick himself said that Deckard is not meant to be an android. And in the first 5 versions of the film, namely the working print, the sneak preview, the 1982 theatrical release, the international theatrical release, and the 1986 broadcast version, there are no overt explicit hints that Deckard is a replicant. But that all changed drastically starting with the 1992 director's cut. The key change was the insertion of a partial version of a dream sequence where Deckard sees a unicorn running in a forest. When you put the dream sequence together with an origami unicorn that Gaff makes and leaves for Deckard to discover at the end of the film, you are driven to the interpretation that Gaff knows what Deckard is dreaming about. And how could he know unless Deckard's dream was artificially implanted, leading to the inescapable conclusion, so some argue, that Deckard is a replicant just like Rachel. The Final Cut version we're seeing tonight includes an even fuller version of the unicorn dream. And Ridley Scott is on the record as saying that Deckard is definitely a replicant. He says that's the whole reason for the whole subplot about Gaff and his crazy origami habit. Harrison Ford absolutely hates this interpretation. He has always insisted that he played Deckard as a human, and that if he played Deckard as a replicant, it would take all the wind out of the story. Now, the writers of the sequel to this movie, Blade Runner 2049, which I'm not really going to talk about, made their protagonist a replicant, but they stayed neutral about whether Deckard is a replicant. I think that in the end, if you look at the novel and all of the versions of Blade Runner, plus the sequel, it all adds up to a kind of giant transmedia creation that has unfolded over nearly 5 decades now with multiple authors. And I think you have to say that the authorship, the collective authorship of this transmedia narrative has concluded that the question should stay unresolved. If Deckard is a replicant, he doesn't know it. If he's human, he's such a robotic human that it kind of makes the actual replicants look more human. And in the end, I don't think we're supposed to know, for sure. I think we're supposed to think about the question itself. And then we're supposed to ask ourselves why we're asking the question and why it matters. Roy Batty wants to live, and in the end, he shows mercy. Rachel has memories that feel real to her. Deckard falls in love, and he wants to protect the woman he loves. So they all have an equal claim on personhood and on the respect due to all conscious beings. That's all that really matters. Blade Runner sinks its teeth into that argument, and it never lets go, and that's part of what makes this a great movie. Thanks, and enjoy.